Few researchers have compared myths from the Baltic and Atlantic regions, but discovering parallels between them could reveal either cultural exchanges or ancient migrations from the Baltic shores to the Atlantic. A possible link might have persisted into the early Middle Ages and could help explain the roots of Arthurian legend in Celtic Britain. The island of Avalon, central to Arthur's myth, recalls the Baltic island Abylos, described by Pliny as near the Amber coasts and by Timaeus as Basilia, meaning royal. This resemblance led scholars like Jean Marchal to see a symbolic and perhaps historical connection between Avalon and the Baltic. In Warsaw, a legend tells of a prince turned into a stone bear, waiting for a kiss to restore his human form, a story that mirrors King Arthur's state of enchanted sleep on Avalon. The bear, whose name echoes Arthur's etymology from the Greek arctos, held sacred meaning across northern Europe. Near Mount Schlenja in Lower Silesia stands an ancient bear statue from the Lusacian culture, and in Finnish mythology, the bear symbolized ancestral spirits and was addressed only through respectful nicknames like Kontio. The golden apples of Avalon also recall those from the Garden of the Hesperides, which Heracles sought in his western journey. These appear again in the myth of Atalanta, who was nurtured by a bear and defeated in a race when distracted by Aphrodite's golden apples. In Baltic belief, the apple represented the sun goddess Sol, whose golden apple symbolized the setting sun. Latvian folk songs even describe her nocturnal journey in a golden boat. Another motif, the sacred water bird, connects Baltic and Atlantic traditions. The Slavic god Radagast was depicted with a bird on his head, much like the goddess of Dineolt in Brittany, who bore a goose. This imagery extended into Arthurian myth. Arthur's mother, Igraine, has a name derived from goose, and his helmet was called Goswif. Such symbols, also found in Adriatic Venetia, where warriors' helmets featured birds, suggest that elements of Arthurian iconography may preserve traces of a much older Northern European, mythic heritage. The ancient land of Hyperoreia was first linked to Great Britain by Hecataeus of Abdera, a Greek historian from the 4th century BC. According to Diodorus Siculus, he described it as a northern island, as large as Sicily, lying beyond the lands of the Celts. Its people, the Hyperboreans, literally those beyond the north wind, lived in a fertile land with a remarkably mild climate. The Greeks associated Hyperborea with the god Apollo, and Hecataeus even mentioned a great circular temple there. While Stonehenge has often been connected to this legend, it predates Celtic culture by millennia, making a direct link unlikely. Later writers like Pseudo-Simnus and Ptolemy placed Hyperborea in the far north, near the edges of Gaul and the North Sea, suggesting that the British Isles could have been its true location. Some even speculated that its people might have come from the Baltic region, especially since the island of Rügen in Pomerania was known as a sacred site of Apollo, the god associated with amber. Traces of Apollo's worship later appeared in Roman Britain, especially in southern Scotland. Inscriptions such as Deo Mapono from Vindolanda and Deo Mapono Apolloni from Corbridge identify the local deity Maponos with Apollo. Place names like Loch Maben, the Maben Stone, and the site Locus Maponi in the Ravenna cosmography confirm that this cult was widespread. Statues depict Mabon holding a harp and sometimes standing beside Diana, linking him to themes of light, music, and the hunt. The figure of Mabon also symbolized the autumn equinox, complementing the spring equinox, a seasonal division that echoes older Anatolian beliefs about gods being confined in winter and released in summer. This mythic figure spread widely across the Celtic world. In Ireland, Maponos was equated with Angus mac in Og, son of the god Dagda. In Wales, he appeared as Mabon ap Modron, the son of the mother, whose story of abduction and later rescue by King Arthur was preserved in the Mabinogion. The very name of this Welsh collection, as well as the lost poem Lai du Mabon, stems from this ancient deity. Through the migration of King Cuneda's people from southern Scotland to Wales, the cult and stories of Mabon likely traveled westward, later reappearing in Brittany as the knight Mabon in Chrétien de Troyes' Eric, and as Mabuse, the Lady of the Lake's son, in Lanzalais. The Scottish place name Fonto Mabono seems related to Fons Aponi near Padua, where a temple to the healing god Aponis once stood. This connection raises the question of where Apollo's earliest worship truly began. Perhaps in ancient Venetia, in the Baltic north, or even in Britain itself. The name of the Hittite god, Apollonius, protector of Wilusa, appears to be an older version of Apollo's name and suggests deep Anatolian roots. Since Apollo supported the Trojans in Homer's Iliad, and the Paphlagonian Eneti were associated with both Anatolia and the Baltic regions, one can imagine a vast cultural continuum linking these distant lands. Over time, Apollo's solar cult may have evolved from an earlier feminine sun deity, much like the Baltic goddess Sol. The symbolism of the golden apple, present in both Sol's imagery and the mythic root of Apollo's name, suggests continuity between these traditions. The swan, sacred to both Apollo and Aphrodite, further unites these myths of light, beauty, and rebirth across the ancient world, from the Baltic shores to the British Isles. Direct evidence linking the Venetic peoples of the Baltic and those of Brittany is still uncertain, though linguistic and archaeological hints suggest possible ancient connections. The similarity between the names of the Veneti of Poland and the Veneti of Brittany is intriguing but insufficient on its own. The English Channel served as a major maritime corridor from the Baltic to the Atlantic, making contact and migration between these regions plausible. The 19th century Slovenian scholar Davoran Trstenjak proposed that early Veneti might have sailed from the Baltic to Brittany, motivated by trade rather than conquest. Archaeological discoveries of Baltic amber in Bronze Age Brittany, particularly in Côte d'Armor, support the idea of an amber trade route extending to the Atlantic. Later, the Veneti of Armorica may have shifted focus to the tin trade with Cornwall and Devon, whose mines were crucial to early metallurgy. Around 1100 BC, the Urnfield culture began spreading into Armorica, marking the movement of Central European warrior groups. While its overall influence in Brittany was limited, distinctive Urnfield pottery has been uncovered in the Morbihan region, the future heartland of the Armorican Veneti, at sites such as Carnac, Trinité-sur-Mer, and Crach. These dark, globular vases date to about 800 to 750 BC, preceding the Celtic presence in the area. Their craftsmanship and design suggest links with eastern France and perhaps with Proto-Venetic migrants originating in the Baltic. Similar evidence appears on Belle-Île-en-Mer, where a necropolis from the 10th century BC connects the region to late Bronze Age Urnfield traditions. Cremation urns from Plomur and decorative ceramics from Elven and Damgan further indicate cultural continuity between Baltic and Atlantic Europe. The spread of Urnfield burial customs into Lower Normandy, home of the ancient Veneli, strengthens the case for a broad migration or exchange network extending from the Baltic coast to western France. linguistic research adds another layer to this picture. Although little is known about the language of the Armorican Veneti, an inscription from Plumergat reading Atrabo Agantobo shows the same plural dative form found among Adriatic Veneti. Professor Jadranka Gvozdanovic of Heidelberg University has identified phonetic patterns in the Venadotei's dialect of southern Brittany that resemble Slavic linguistic evolution, including features like bisyllabic palatalization and asymmetric softening of consonants, traits that may echo an ancient Balto-Venetic substrate. Genetic studies reveal that modern Bretons are closer to the Welsh than to central French populations, reflecting the long-standing Atlantic cultural unity between Brittany and Britain. Ancient authors, however, classified the Veneti among the Belgae, a loosely defined group of maritime tribes inhabiting northern Gaul and parts of Britain. Strabo and Posidonius described Armoricans as Belgians, though Caesar himself, while familiar with the Veneti, did not list them among the 17 Belgic tribes. This suggests that the label Belgic was geographical and naval rather than ethnically precise. Later scholars note that the Belgic world included both Celtic and Germanic elements, reflecting a mixed coastal culture rather than a single ethnic identity. Modern interpretations, such as those by Edward Dawson and Peter Kessler, view the Belgae as seafaring peoples of northern Europe whose origins may reach back to the Baltic coast. Archaeological data align them with northern German and Pomeranian cultures, possibly linked to the Oxhoft culture in eastern Pomerania between the 2nd century BC and 1st century AD. This culture emerged from the earlier Pomeranian tradition and appears to have developed during a major wave of population movements from northern Germany. Altogether, the archaeological, linguistic, and maritime evidence suggests that the Veneti of Armorica may have inherited cultural elements, if not direct ancestry, from a far older Baltic Venetic world that once stretched from the shores of the Vistula to the Atlantic. From the pre-Roman period onward, the Veneti established fortified coastal settlements in Brittany and southwestern England, described by Caesar as strong maritime bastions. Archaeologists have long searched for parallels between these sites and similar Iron Age forts in Atlantic Scotland, suggesting they formed part of an extended maritime network linking Brittany, England, and the north. However, more recent dating indicates that some of these fortifications are older than once thought, potentially connecting them to Proto-Venetic settlers from the Urnfield culture, active around 800 BC. The timber-framed construction of many Scottish hill forts, especially in the territory later inhabited by the Venicones, also points to a continental architectural origin resembling the Murus Gallicus style described by Caesar. Additional evidence of early cultural links comes from distinctive fingerprint ceramics discovered in the Vale of York, a region stretching between the Humber and the Tees. These finds, dating from the Hallstatt Sea period, connect northern England to wider European traditions rather than to purely local developments. The area later became the territory of the Brigantes, a major tribe whose settlements at York, Binchester, and Isurium show signs of long-term occupation. Further north in Scotland, discoveries at Balmashanner and Kincardine Moss, amber jewelry, bronze cauldrons, and ritual objects dating from roughly 600 to 400 BC suggest cultural continuity and trade links reaching deep into the Atlantic world. The origins of the Picts, ancient inhabitants of Scotland, have also been tied to the north and east. Bede, in his ecclesiastical history, believed they came from Scythia, a name that in antiquity referred not only to lands around the Black Sea, but also to regions near Poland and the Baltic. He recorded that the Picts first sailed to Ireland and, being refused settlement, continued to northern Britain. This story echoes other medieval traditions that traced Scottish ancestry to Scythian or Trojan roots, as seen in the Declaration of Arbroath and the legend of Brutus, founder of Britain. Such myths reflect ancient attempts to connect the peoples of the Atlantic and Baltic worlds through shared origins and migrations. Understanding the true beginnings of the Armorican Veneti requires solid archaeological evidence rather than linguistic speculation. Theories about their name, derived either from the Celtic Veni or the Indo-European Ven, do not by themselves reveal ethnic identity. The linguist André Martinet proposed that an Indo-European-speaking Venetic people once inhabited what is now Poland around the late 3rd to early 4th century 2nd millennium BC. Some groups moved westward and became assimilated by Celtic tribes. Others migrated south and interacted with Italic cultures, while those remaining in the east, the Vinds, merged over time with Germanic and Slavic populations. An unusual clue to the Venetic question even comes from modern medicine. A rare hereditary heart condition, arrhythmogenic right ventricular dysplasia, occurs most frequently in 3 regions of Europe: around the Vistula River in Poland, in the Adriatic near ancient Veneto, and in Brittany. This geographic overlap mirrors the known distribution of Venetic settlements, hinting at an ancient genetic continuity. Genetic studies further show that Breton populations share closer ancestry with the Welsh than with Central French groups, underscoring the old Atlantic cultural unity between Brittany and Britain. The dominant Y-DNA lineage in Brittany was probably present there long before the 5th century migrations of Britons fleeing Anglo-Saxon invasions. Archaeological continuity suggests the Armorican Veneti maintained their identity despite Roman conquest and Caesar's propaganda, which exaggerated their defeat for political effect. By the 2nd century AD, they had regained influence as seafaring traders, exporting tin, salt, and garum to the British Isles and Rhine Valley. Roman maps like the Tabula Peutingeriana confirm their continued prosperity into the 4th century AD. Though their coinage declined later, likely due to Saxon disruption, there was no break in material culture when Britons from across the Channel migrated into Brittany. Local pottery and coin styles persisted, showing that the Armorican Veneti remained culturally stable. Their territory contracted only in the 6th century when Guérande fell to the Namnete. It is also plausible that, following Caesar's campaigns, some Armorican Veneti relocated inland or sailed to Britain, joining existing Venetic communities there. This process may have unfolded in several waves. After Caesar's victory, while many Veneti leaders were executed and others enslaved, survivors likely fled across the Channel to allied colonies in southern Britain, where Venetic merchants had long traded for tin. These migrants, along with their families, helped shift the Venetic maritime presence from mainland Armorica to the islands, ensuring that, even in defeat, their seafaring traditions and cultural identity endured across the western seas. As Roman forces advanced through Britain, groups of Veneti who had resisted imperial control appear to have withdrawn northward into Scotland, beyond the Antonine Wall. The 4th century historian Ammianus Marcellinus wrote that these Veneti braved the Atlantic repeatedly, sailing far beyond known lands toward the mysterious Thule, described by ancient Greek authors, a term that likely referred to the far northern regions of Britain. Beyond the Roman frontier lived the Venicones, whose name closely resembles Venicones, an ethnonym from northern Italy, suggesting a possible link between these peoples. Their movement north may have reflected both resistance to Roman authority and a continuation of their seafaring traditions. During the later Roman occupation, the Veneti, referred to as Venadotei in some records, became involved in violent political conflicts. Around 296 AD, they reportedly took part in the Siege of London, where they executed captured Romans and cast their heads into the river Nantgallum. Though this episode sounds legendary, excavations have indeed uncovered severed skulls in the area. The incident likely arose from factional strife between the Praetorian prefect Asclepiodotus and his rival Alectus, who had earlier assassinated Carausius, the self-proclaimed King of the Britons. Given that Carausius led the Maeatae, a tribe allied with the Veneti, it seems the latter supported his break from Rome and opposed Alectus's rule. By the early medieval period, the name of the Venicones reappears indirectly in Welsh tradition. In the poem Manau Godin, the territory of Maen Gwynwen may echo their ancient homeland. Scholars have proposed that the Venicones, together with the Votadini, migrated south under King Kuneda, settling in North Wales between the late 4th and early 5th centuries. There they became known as the Venadotei, giving their name to Venadotia. This migration may have been part of a larger return movement from Britain to Armorica, as noted by the Frankish chronicler Einhard, who wrote that the Veneti of Britain later went back to Gaul. In the 6th century, during renewed upheavals caused by Saxon expansion and possibly worsened by the great Ilopango volcanic eruption in Central America, another wave of settlers under King Warwick established the kingdom of Brorek in southern Brittany. This migration strengthened the continuity between Wales and Brittany, where the Venetic presence is still preserved in place names. Cultural traces of the Veneti may also survive in ancient descriptions of ritual body painting. Pliny recorded that the Britons painted themselves with a blue-green pigment called glastum, from the root glass, meaning green or blue, likely derived from woad. Similar practices were later associated with the Picts, whose name itself may refer to painted or tattooed people. Their appearance, recorded from 297 AD onward, suggests that such customs persisted in northern Britain long after Roman contact. On Armorican coins of the Coriosolites, traders closely linked to the Veneti, tattooed faces are also depicted. The sacred color of the Veneti was traditionally light blue, the same hue used in ancient Mediterranean iconography for divine figures. And processions of painted or even naked women appear in early Venetian artifacts from northern Italy, hinting at a shared symbolic heritage. In eastern Scotland, the Venicones' lands extended from Fife to Angus. Roman military campaigns reached this area roughly a century and a half after Caesar's first invasion of Britain. Although Caesar claimed to have conquered the entire island, archaeological evidence tells a different story. Roman marching camps and forts in Angus and along the Forth Valley indicate that the region was contested for generations. It remains unclear whether the Venicones fought at the Battle of Mons Graupius, where Agricola's forces defeated the Caledon. Confederation near present-day Perth. Agricola's campaigns, conducted through winter as well as summer, devastated northern resistance. Today, excavations north of the Forth continue to reshape our understanding of settlement patterns in early Scotland. Yet the Venicones remain enigmatic, known by name but scarcely visible in the archaeological record. Their connection to both the Picts and the older Venetic seafaring peoples of Armorica remains possible, suggesting that the Venicones may have represented one of the final northern branches of a long Atlantic-Baltic tradition that once stretched from the Vistula to the Scottish Highlands. At the northern edge of Roman expansion in Britain stood the fortress of Inchtuthil, known to the Romans as Pinata Castra, built around 83 AD by the governor Agricola during his campaign against the Caledonians. Located near Perth on the banks of the River Tay, it was a massive military base, housing about 5,000 soldiers of the 20th Legion, covering over 20 hectares. It marked the northernmost advance of Roman power and symbolized imperial ambition and endurance. Although the Romans later withdrew, the region saw renewed activity under Antoninus Pius around 140 AD, when he established a new defensive frontier, the Antonine Wall, stretching between the Firth of Forth and the Firth of Clyde. This fortification, consisting of 19 forts, an earthen rampart, wooden palisade, and deep ditch, formed a short-lived northern border before being abandoned around 164 AD, as Roman forces retreated southward once again. According to Ptolemy, the Venicones occupied the Angus region during the 2nd century, living just beyond the Roman frontier near the fortress line. Archaeological evidence suggests that their relations with the Romans were largely peaceful. Far from being exterminated, the Venicones likely supported the legions by supplying grain and maintaining storage facilities, Hyperoreia, from which their chief town, Hyperoreia, took its name. These underground granaries, common near Roman garrisons, show that the Venicones were part of the logistical system that sustained the army in Scotland. The discovery of coin hoards in Angus also indicates a degree of prosperity arising from this interaction. Yet, despite early cooperation, the Venicones disappear from written records after Ptolemy, leaving open the question of their fate. The Romans did not establish permanent towns or villas in Angus, and the native population continued to live in roundhouses and practice local traditions. Over time, the number of settlements and artifacts declined, perhaps signaling migration or cultural absorption. The region's later name, Circen, linked to the Pictish ancestor Cruthen, suggests that Pictish influence gradually replaced the older Venetic identity. During the campaigns of Septimius Severus and Caracalla in the early 3rd century, Roman operations targeted a confederation known as the Maeatae, though the exact extent of their territory remains uncertain. Place names such as Dumyat near Stirling point to their presence just beyond the Antonine Wall, with Maeatae Hill marking a possible southern boundary. By the late 4th century, Roman historians like Ammianus Marcellinus no longer mentioned the Venicones, but referred instead to the Verturiones, whose kingdom of Fortriu was once thought to include Perthshire and Strathearn. Modern scholarship, particularly the work of Alex Wolff, has shifted Fortriu's location northward to the Moray region, suggesting that earlier assumptions about the Verturiones territory were mistaken. This raises the question of whether the Venicones had already been absorbed or displaced by the Maeatae by that time. Distinct burial customs distinguish the Venicones from neighboring peoples. They cremated their dead and buried the ashes beneath stone cairns, a rare practice in Britain that marks them as a distinct group. Their closest cultural parallels appear among the Tyaxali, another northern tribe known for depositing ornate bronze and brass objects in lakes as ritual offerings. These heavy arm rings, weighing up to 1.5 kilograms and dating between 43 and 200 AD, demonstrate advanced metalwork and shared ritual traditions. By the late 2nd century, caught between Roman pressure from the south and Caledonian tribes from the north, the Venicones may have joined a defensive alliance with the Taixali and Vacomagi. This coalition, likely recognized by Rome under the governor Ulpius Marcellus, was later known as the Maeatae, a federation of southern Pictish tribes. The name probably derives from the Latin meta, or Greek meta, referring to their location beyond the Roman frontier. The heartland of the Maeatae lay just north of the Antonine Wall, in what had once been the homeland of the Venicones. Through such alliances and gradual integration, the Venicones disappeared as a distinct tribal entity, their legacy absorbed into the emerging Pictish confederations of early medieval Scotland. Around the year 210 AD, the Maeatae tribes of northern Britain took advantage of Emperor Septimius Severus's illness to rise in rebellion against Rome. Archaeological evidence from battle sites in Fife suggests that the revolt began there and quickly spread across the region. Severus personally led a campaign into Angus, becoming the first Roman emperor to march so far north. Near the confluence of the rivers Tay and Erne, his army, principally the 6th Legion, constructed a new fortress at Carpow to control access to Caledonian territory. This fort, capable of housing about 3,000 soldiers, stood close to Hyperoreia, the capital of the Venicones, and symbolized Rome's determination to subdue the northern tribes. When Severus's health worsened, his son Caracalla took command and continued the campaign with brutal orders for extermination. Despite his father's genocidal command, the Roman advance ultimately failed. Caledonian resistance strengthened, and after the campaign collapsed, the Romans withdrew permanently to Hadrian's Wall. By the early 5th century, the empire was facing growing crises on the continent. The invasions of the Visigoths and the pressure of the Huns forced the Roman general Stilicho to recall troops from Britain to defend Italy. The Roman withdrawal between 402 and 410 AD left the island exposed, and imperial forces never returned. In the ensuing power vacuum, local Britons, identified in the Welsh poem Y Gododin as Prideni, a name derived from Pryden, meaning land of the Picts, attempted to preserve their autonomy. It is possible that the Maeatae, descendants of the Venicones and related northern peoples, played a role in forming this early British identity. As Roman power faded, Gaelic expansion and political fragmentation pushed many of these northern Britons southward. Some migrated into Wales, where new polities emerged amid the ruins of Roman authority. One such group was the Venadotei of northern Wales, whose presence is confirmed by a 5th century gravestone. Their arrival corresponds with the legendary migration led by King Kuneda from the region of Manau Godin in central Scotland. Medieval chroniclers such as Geoffrey of Monmouth, Alan of Lille, and Giraldus Cambrensis all refer to Venadotei as the Latin name for North Wales, suggesting a memory of Venetic ancestry linking the Britons of Gwynedd to their northern forebears. Archaeological evidence also points to a deeper continuity. In Fife, where the Venicones once lived, dozens of urnfield burials have been discovered, 30 at Scottstarvet Hill and 22 at Carfin House, with similar finds in Clackmannan, St. Andrews, and near Edinburgh. These cremation cemeteries, dating to the Middle and Late Bronze Age, mirror funerary traditions associated with the ancient Veneti of the Adriatic, strengthening the notion of shared origins across Europe. According to Welsh tradition, Kuneda was the grandson of Padarn Beisrud ap Tegid, a figure sometimes viewed as a Roman officer who commanded frontier forces in Scotland under Magnus Maximus around 380 AD. Other interpretations describe him as a local tribal leader, granted Roman rank as part of the empire's frontier policy. His son, Edern, was Kuneda's father, linking this lineage to both Roman and native traditions. Kuneda's homeland, Manau Godin, centered on Stirling, the strategic gateway to the Highlands, was vital for controlling northern Britain. From this base, he and his followers likely migrated south into Wales in search of security and fertile land after Rome's collapse. Before the rise of Gododin as a kingdom, the Stirling region was known to the Romans as the land of the Venicones. The Gododin polity emerged only around 470 AD under King Lot Ludoc, who ruled from Traprain law, later known as Lothian in his honor. Lot's marriage to Morgause, the sister of the legendary King Arthur, and their son Mordred's betrayal at Camelot were later woven into Arthurian tradition. Archaeological discoveries at Traprain Law support this image of shifting loyalties. A magnificent hoard of over 100 Roman silver pieces found there likely represents payments for Votadini mercenaries allied with Rome. Linguistically, the Votadini and the Picts were closely related, though culturally distinct. The Venicones, in contrast, had remained outside Roman rule, providing supplies rather than soldiers to the legions stationed near the Antonine Wall. That wall, built by Antoninus Pius and abandoned after just 20 years, marked the last great northern frontier of Rome in Britain. Beyond it, peoples like the Venicones, Maeatae, and later Picts continued to shape the early medieval identity of northern Britain, bridging the memory of the ancient Veneti with the emerging nations of the Celtic world. In 368 AD, Emperor Valentinian I sent the general Flavius Theodosius to Britain to suppress what Roman historians called the Great Conspiracy, a large-scale invasion of the island by northern tribes and foreign raiders. The Scots and Picts had advanced into the regions of Manau and the Votadini, exploiting the weakening of Roman authority. Theodosius swiftly restored order, defeating the invaders and reorganizing the island into 5 provinces: Britannia Prima, Britannia Secunda, Flavia Caesariensis, Maxima Caesariensis, and Valentia, the latter named in honor of Valentinian himself. According to Ammianus Marcellinus, 2 main Pictish groups, the Dicolydones and the Verturiones, joined forces with the Scots and Attacoti to devastate Roman territory. Though Theodosius re-established control, raids from the north continued in the decades that followed. Between 388 and 395 AD, the Romans attempted to reinforce their defenses, and Gildas later described Britain's frontier as a wall of turf from sea to sea, probably referring to renewed efforts to maintain or patrol the Antonine Wall as protection against Pictish incursions. During this time, the province of Valentia was formed between Hadrian's Wall and the Antonine Wall, serving as a buffer zone that included the Votadini. Yet Roman control of the province lasted only about 40 years before the imperial forces were finally withdrawn around 410 AD. Though there may have been a brief Roman expedition around 420, the withdrawal marked the end of imperial authority in Britain. After the collapse of Roman power, the identity of the northern kingdoms grew increasingly complex. The region known as Manau Godin has long puzzled historians, as it is unclear whether Manau referred to an older realm that later came under the control of the Votadini, or whether it was a misunderstanding by later chroniclers such as Nennius. The name Manau may have derived from the sea god Manon, while Gododin appears to have been a later designation after the Romans' departure. Recent research has challenged traditional assumptions about the Votadini's location and influence. Archaeological and geographical reinterpretations by scholars like Martin Goldberg suggest that the Votadini were based farther south in what is now Northumbria, rather than in central Scotland. Excavations at Traprain Law, once thought to be their capital, indicate that the site was mainly active in the Late Bronze Age, with only limited use during the Iron Age, possibly for seasonal gatherings or under negotiated Roman supervision. The tribe's true center may have been Yeavering Bell near Wooler, further south, aligning with the known early centers of Bernicia. Historical records also show that after the Roman withdrawal, new power structures emerged. The Chronica Gallica states that Saxon dominance in Britain began around 441 AD. During this period, King Vortigern of Powys invited Saxon mercenaries to help defend against northern invaders, most likely Pictish forces, among whom may have been Kuneda and his warriors from Manau. Kuneda's migration to Wales around 440 AD fits chronologically with these events, suggesting that he led his people southward during the chaotic aftermath of Roman collapse. In Wales, his descendants founded the Kingdom of Venadotei, modern Gwynedd, and later chroniclers such as Geoffrey of Monmouth, Alan of Lille, and Giraldus Cambrensis continued to use Venadotei as the Latin term for North Wales, preserving a memory of Venetic or northern origins. In the same period, Powys emerged as a dominant Welsh kingdom, extending from the River Severn to the Irish Sea. Its towns were said to have sought aid from a man of Lidaw, a term associated with the Snowdonia region in Venadotei, and also used poetically to mean Britain. This man was almost certainly King Kuneda, who became the founder of the Gwynedd dynasty. Poetic and linguistic evidence also preserves echoes of these northern roots. In Wigododin, the phrase, "the young son of Cian from Maen Gwyngon," appears to reference Manau Veniconia, the land of the Venicones. The Welsh term, Maen Gwyngon, has been interpreted as stone of the Venicones, possibly alluding to the ancient standing stone at Clackmannan, near Stirling. Other literary sources, such as the Book of Taliesin, call Arthur Lord of Calchvind, a name related to calch, chalk, or stone, and possibly linked to the same geographical area. The connection between Kuneda and the Votadini, traditionally recorded by Nennius in the 9th century, is now viewed with skepticism. Written 4 centuries after the events, his account likely merged legend with political motives, aiming to Christianize and legitimize the royal line of Gwynedd. His portrayal of Kuneda as a descendant of the Romanized commander Padarn Baesrud appears more symbolic than factual. Later hagiography even traced Padarn's ancestry back to the biblical line of Judah, an obvious invention meant to provide sacred authority to the Welsh monarchy. In reality, Kuneda and his people probably came from a mixed pagan background, retaining elements of the older Celtic faith centered on deities like Dagda, the god of storms. Pagan practices persisted in parts of Wales and Brittany long after official conversion, and even royal families often kept pre-Christian traditions privately. Religious distinctions further separated these northern peoples. While the Votadini and southern tribes had been partly Christianized through early missionaries such as Saint Ninian, the Picts and Venicones remained pagan until the early 8th century. King Nectan's construction of a Roman-style church around 710 marked the formal adoption of Roman Christianity in Pictland. During Kuneda's lifetime, however, the northern peoples were still considered Gentiles in the classical sense, following ancestral rites. There was also no blood connection between Kuneda's dynasty and that of Lot, the semi-legendary king of Lothian, who ruled from Traprain law, and whose family was later woven into Arthurian legend. Lot's line likely descended from the southern Catuvellani tribe, whose name survives in the Welsh Cadwallon. The medieval romances that made Lot Arthur's uncle were literary creations rather than history. Roman authors, such as Tacitus, described the Votadini and Damnoni as tribes inhabiting the zone between Hadrian's and Antonine walls, forming part of the province of Valentia. This positioning places the Votadini south of Manau and adjacent to the Damnoni, whose lands lay just below the Antonine frontier. Their shared border likely ran from Biggar to Edinburgh, roughly corresponding to the later boundaries of Lothian. Altogether, the evidence suggests that the traditional link between Kuneda and the Votadini was a later invention rooted in myth-making and Christian reinterpretation. The true origins of Kuneda's people seem to lie further north, in the old land of the Venicones and other Pictish tribes who merged during the twilight of Roman Britain. Over time, history, legend, and faith intertwined to create a narrative that connected the northern pagans of Scotland to the Christian kings of Wales, bridging the fading world of Rome with the dawn of the medieval Celtic kingdoms. Although most scholars today identify the Votadini with the later kingdom of Godin, it is still possible that the name Manau Godin derived instead from Urbs Goidi, the Latin name Bade used for a sterling. The origins of Venadotei are equally puzzling. If Kuneda truly led a migration of Votadini warriors from the north, the new kingdom should have carried the name Votadinia, and its people would have been called Votadini, not Venadotei. This inconsistency suggests that Kuneda himself may have belonged to a Venetic rather than a Votadinian lineage, or that his name was of Venetic origin. The term Venadotei may have referred to seafaring people like the Veneti of Brittany, whose true homeland was the ocean rather than the land. It is even possible that Kuneda was not a personal name, but a title or nickname given by his followers, which later confused genealogical traditions. What is certain is that he led a warlike people who expelled the Irish settlers from northern Wales, particularly the Uí Leothian colonies of the Lynn Peninsula. Before his arrival, there is no mention of a tribe called the Venadotei in Wales, which means that they were newcomers, not locals who expanded their territory. Some earlier records mention a group of Venadotei in London as early as 296 AD, allied with the Roman prefect Asclepiodotus in the revolt against the usurper Alectus, who had murdered Carausius, the king of the Britons. Carausius belonged to the Maeatae, a Belgic tribe allied with the Veneti, suggesting that the Venadotei may have been part of this wider Venetic network. Both the Maeatae and the Venicones were powerful seafarers, and it is plausible that the Venadotei who appeared in London came from the northern coasts of Scotland, perhaps from Angus, where the Venicones lived. The similarity of names supports this theory, and the difference between Venicones and Venadotei could easily be explained by linguistic evolution over a century and a half. The territories of Godin and Manau may once have formed a dual kingdom, similar to later composite realms like Austria-Hungary. Godin's garrisons, however, were not renowned for military skill. According to some accounts, they were slow to mobilize and poorly equipped, leaving them vulnerable to the fierce naval raids of the Picts. Around 398 AD, Pictish fleets sailed from the harbors of Fife, Tay, Angus, and the Moray Firth, ravaging the southern coasts. In this volatile setting, it became nearly impossible for the Votadini to maintain control north of the Antonine Wall. Even though Manau lay inland, the Firth of Forth and its river allowed easy navigation up to Stirling, which Bede referred to as Urbs Guidi. The Welsh called the Firth Merin Iodio, the Sea of Udiu, a reminder of its strategic importance. Cuneda's strength lay in his cavalry, a hallmark of Venetic warfare, and his elite horsemen became legendary in Wales. Their tradition of mounted nobility likely inspired later myths of Arthur's knights. Manau itself, situated between the Roman frontier and the northern tribes, may have acted as a neutral buffer zone. If any people were suited for this intermediary role, it was the Veneti, an independent, non-Celtic maritime culture accustomed to diplomacy and trade. On the summit of Dumyat in the Ochil Hills, the remains of a fortress still overlook the plains of Stirling. Its name is thought to derive from Dun Mete, Fort of the Maeatae, the confederation that included the Venicones. Near this same area, in Clackmannanshire, stood Clach na Manau, the Stone of Manau, believed to be the rallying point from which Cuneda gathered his people before migrating to Wales. The surrounding landscape, including nearby Slamanan and Camelot, preserves echoes of both Venetic and Arthurian tradition. After Cuneda's departure, his son Tibian remained in Manau, but did not found a dynasty. Control of the region seems to have passed to a local ruler named Brychan of Manau, whose lineage was separate from Cuneda's. Brychan's daughter, Lian, married the Gaelic king Gabran, and their son, Aidan mac Gabran, later became Prince of Forth through the matrilineal succession of the Picts. This marriage symbolized the gradual merging of Pictish and Gaelic power in the region. Meanwhile, remnants of the Maeatae, southern Picts mentioned by Adamnan in Vita Columbae, continued to inhabit the area. Around the year 600, the Welsh poem Wai Gododin commemorated the warriors of Manau Godin, who rode from Ceredigion to their deaths in battle against the Angles. Their presence there, long after Cuneda's migration, raises questions. Had some Votadini remained in the north, maintaining garrisons in Gododin, while others had gone south to Wales? The blending of Venetic, Pictish, and Votadinian traditions makes the answer uncertain. Another intriguing link between Britain and Brittany appears in the figure of Saint Padarn, a 6th century bishop born in Armorica. His name and legend closely parallel those of Cuneda's grandfather, Padarn Beisrud ap Tegid, paternus of the scarlet robe. In the Breton hagiographies, Saint Padarn's most famous episode recounts King Arthur's attempt to steal his red cloak, an allegory for usurping royal power. The scarlet robe, one of Britain's mythical treasures, symbolized sovereignty, and its theft echoed Arthur's challenge to the old Venetic authority represented by Padarn. When Christian Britons fled the Saxon invasions in the 5th and 6th centuries, they re-established their homeland across the Channel in Brittany, founding the kingdom of Bro Gwynedd. Its capital, formerly the Venetic city of Hyperoreia, became Gwynedd. This continuity strongly suggests that the Britons who settled there were none other than the Venadotei of Wales, returning to their ancestral coast. The figure of Caradog Fricfras, both a legendary Welsh hero and a Breton patron, embodies this connection, linking the rulers of Gwent and Vaughan under one Venetic heritage. As for the origins of the Arthurian tradition, its Western maritime character points to the Veneti rather than the Votadini. The Venetic homelands were surrounded by islands long associated with Avalon, the mystical resting place of Arthur, whereas the Votadini lands in eastern Britain had few such features. Alistair Moffat proposed that Avalon might be identified with a river island at Kelso, sacred to the Celts and known as Orkert. But this interpretation lacks the mythic depth of Avalon's legendary sea voyage. In contrast, the western seas once navigated by the Veneti, dotted with misty islands and ancient sanctuaries, fit perfectly with the imagery of Arthur's final journey. Taken together, the historical and mythological evidence suggests a more nuanced picture. When Agricola conquered eastern Scotland, many Venicones submitted to Rome, while others fled north to the highlands. Under Roman administration, new client kingdoms such as Manau Godin were established to counter Pictish raids, ruled by local leaders under Roman and later Votadinian oversight. Figures like Kuneda, though described as kings of the Votadini, may in fact have been Venetic sub-kings operating under Votadinian authority. When the Roman legions finally withdrew, this hierarchy collapsed, freeing Kuneda to lead his people southward. In this way, the Venicones, seafarers turned warriors, carried their traditions into Wales, where they became the Venadotei of Gwynedd, heirs to a legacy that bridged Rome, Britain, and the seafaring Veneti of the Atlantic world. Local tradition in central Scotland equates Camelot with Camelon, the Roman fort at Falkirk on the Antonine frontier. Adam Ardrey argues that the Gaelic prince Arthur mac Adain reused this outpost and died nearby in 594, reading the Irish annals of Tigernach, Battle of Corrend, as Caer Edon, Idun's fort, thus making Arthur the historical Arthur. His view clashes with the earliest literary Camelot, first named by Chrétien de Troyes in 1170, and, like Geoffrey of Monmouth before him, associated with Caerleon on the Usk in South Wales. Strategically, Camelon sits 14 miles from Stirling at a fourth estuary inlet between Manau Godin and the southern edge of Venicones territory, and even yielded a striking vessel whose fingerprint rim and mask-like face evoke Urnfield and Pomeranian funerary styles. From this frontier setting, the narrative widens to the name of Scotland itself, Alba, linked by some to Greek Alphos, and by others to an land of the rising sun idea in early Irish lore. In the early Middle Ages, Alba narrowed from the whole island to the Pictish Scotic heartlands, while Scoti became the Latin label for Giles, and the later Kingdom of Alba spanned Moray to Lothian, with close cultural ties to Ireland. Because Arthurian place names dot all of Britain, not only Scotland, the deeper question becomes tribal identity. Which people produced the war leader later remembered as King of the Britons? Candidates span a broad arc of North Atlantic cultures. The seafaring Maeatae, allies of the Armorican Veneti, put forward Carausius, the emperor of Britain and northern Gaul, as a glamorous model linked etymologically to Camulodunum and the war god Camulos. The Brigantes, powerful between Tyne and Humber and devoted to Brigantia, produced formidable chiefs like Venutius, but leave no clear line into Wales. Sarmatian cavalry settled in Britain under Marcus Aurelius carried serpent standards and a near-sacral sword cult, motifs some have tied to Arthurian imagery. Roman Britain itself offers Lucius Artorius Castus, sometimes advanced as a prototype, though his career appears earlier, eastern-facing, and only tenuously connected to Saxon wars. The most developed Scottish Arthur case centers on Arthur mac Aidain of Dal Riata, crowned into command by his father Aidan mac Gabrain and memorialized on Iona, the island many equate with Eamon Ablach, the Isle of Apples, resonant with Avalon's imagery, and the Nine Maidens theme known since Pomponius Mela. Arthur reused the fort at Camelot and died near the Allen, Camelot in legend, close to a 6th century river island settlement called Invalone, which could have nourished Avalon traditions. Early Arthur references surface in Welsh texts, the language of Strathclyde's Brittonic West, where Arthur campaigned, strengthening the cultural bridge. Yet the fit is imperfect. The legendary Arthur halts Saxons, while Arthur fought Maeatae and southern Picts in the old Venicones zone. He neither dies at Camlan against Mordred of Lothian, nor leads Britons versus Angles at Degsastan. That battle belonged to Aidan, not Arthur. The Godin line praising a hero, though he was not Arthur, likely nods to an earlier British champion, perhaps the victor of Mount Badon, whose fame would outshine northern exploits against Picts. Linguistic clues also pull toward a Brittonic, not Gaelic, matrix. Arthur's father's epithet Pendragon is P-Celtic, where Q-Celtic Gaelic would yield Cian Dragon. Even within Venicones country, Charles Thomas judged their speech Celtic despite a non-Celtic-looking tribal name. All told, Scottish archaeology and toponymy preserve powerful Arthurian echoes, Camelot, Avalon, Manau Godin's warbands. But the composite picture suggests that while Arthur Maeatae may preserve a historical strand of the tapestry, the archetypal Arthur belongs to an older Brittonic tradition rooted in Wales and the West, later refracted through Gaelic, Pictish, Roman, and Sarmatian lenses as the legend traveled from the Clyde and Forth to Gwynedd, Brittany, and beyond. Several early voices point north when they talk about the matter of Britain. In 1120, Lambert of Saint-Omer wrote in Latin of Arthur's palace in the land of the Picts, and a century later Berulle set Arthur and the Round Table at Stirling on the Forth. Geoffrey of Monmouth placed campaigns around Dumbarton and Loch Lomond, while Edinburgh's volcanic summit still bears the name Arthur's Seat and crowns a 2,000-year-old hill fort. Chrétien de Troyes' Percival even sends the Grail Knight's sword to be reforged in a lake beyond the Forth, eerily consonant with Bronze Age swords that were broken, burned, and consigned to Duddingston Loch, a pre-Mallory echo of Excalibur's return to the water. The dozen battles ascribed to Arthur often cluster along the later Scottish northern English frontier, threading between Votadini and Venicones country. Andrew Breeze maps several along a belt from the Glen and Douglas waters to the southern uplands, though a Glasgow-based warlord is hard to square with the era's political geography. Some Arthurian fights remembered in Welsh tradition may reflect 7th century Brittonic Mercian forays into Northumbria. Yet in the late 5th and 6th centuries, the west of Britain was still largely Briton-held. Southern Scotland was a contested shield against Angles and Saxons, and figures like Urien of Reged, celebrated in Welsh verse with his son Owain, pressed Bernicia to a narrow littoral. Strikingly, many of Scotland's earliest Arthurian place memories sit in and around the Venicones' old heartlands. The Stirling district has long claimed a round table near the castle, noted by William of Worcester and Sir David Lindsay, with surviving earthworks later re-landscaped but plausibly rooted in an older monument. This makes it conceivable that a pre-Gaelic Arthurian lore, native to Angus and the Forth, later brushed the Gaelic dynasty of Arthur Maeatae through maternal ties in Venicones country, just as his family connections draw us repeatedly to Berry Hill, Magel, the Isla Valley, and ultimately to his last stand at Badandun. Influence likely ran both ways, with the prestige of a 6th century Gaelic prince reinforcing older local legends. The Welsh Peredur, whom Chrétien reworked into Parsifal, is styled Dux Venedatorum in Latin, and Geoffrey of Monmouth's Vita Merlini makes Peredur king of Venadotia and of Albany, knitting Gwynedd and Scotland into one narrative thread. Godin has him survive an epic northern battle, only to fall later at Catraeth. Layered over this is a dense web of Venetic markers: Venicones in Scotland, Venadotia in the northwest of Wales, Gwent in the south, even Stirling's older name Snowdon, mirroring Snowdonia in Arthur's Welsh heartland. If the legend radiated along Atlantic sea roads, the Venadotei, masters of those waters, are uniquely positioned as cultural carriers present in every region most steeped in Arthurian lore. Read spiritually rather than pedantically, the myth's signatures align with Venetic themes: elite cavalry and the horse cult behind the Round Table's chivalry, a Senate-like ideal of primus inter pare that later Venetian institutions echoed, a solar spring god and land goddess pairings, the sword committed to the waters, and a swan-drawn passage to the other world reminiscent of the Venetic solar boat, and a grail prefigured in the ritual situla that poured wine at sacred feasts. Historical pressures also help explain movement. Even if a Baden Age champion checked Saxon advance, the mid-6th century climatic shock, darkened skies from the 535 Ilopango eruption, famine through 539, and pestilence that struck Maelgwyn of Venadotia, coincides with Breton state building at Bro Gwynedd under Warroch, and with a renewed Armorican Welsh traffic that looks less like conquest than kin returning by sea. As for the Votadini, Roman authors place them between the walls, rewarded as a buffer after the legions fell back. Only later does Gododin coalesce as a kingdom, soon swallowed by Northumbria. They loom large in the literature, but often as ambivalent actors. Think of Mordred, Lot's son, recast in romance as the traitor of Camlan, reflecting the real politic of Votadinian accommodation with the Angles, while some of their heirs fought on at Catraeth. Weighing the strands, Scotland preserves a deep stratum of Arthurian topography and memory, but the legend's transmission looks Venetic as much as Votadinian, a maritime myth carried along the Forth and Clyde, across Gwynedd and Gwent, and over to Van, where the sea, not any one province, was the truest homeland of Arthur's tribe. In the centuries after Rome's withdrawal from Britain, storytellers tried to explain who had united the island's war-torn peoples against the Saxons. The Historia Regum Britanniae of Geoffrey of Monmouth, written in 1138, gave the fullest early account of King Arthur's life, but many of its themes were already ancient and clearly native rather than Roman. Geoffrey's vision of Arthur drew on Celtic myth and Welsh legend, tales like the spoils of Anwfn and Culuch ac Olwen, in which Arthur and his companions sail to Ireland aboard the ship Prydwen in search of a magical cauldron that feeds the brave, but not the cowardly. Long before this romantic version appeared, the monk Gildas had described the decisive victory of the Britons over the Saxons at Mount Badon, crediting it not to Arthur, but to the Romanized leader Ambrosius Aurelianus, one of the last survivors of imperial Britain. Later chroniclers, such as Bede, repeated this story, but Gildas's Roman hero seems improbable. The legions had been gone for a century, imperial command had collapsed, and the idea that a Roman aristocrat still led Britain strains belief. His supposed family line, from the usurper Constantine III down to Uther Pendragon and Arthur himself, looks more like a legend grafted onto fading Roman prestige than a plausible genealogy. By contrast, Welsh tradition places the center of resistance in native dynasties descended from Kuneda. Owain Danwyn, Prince of Venadotei, lived at Din Arth, Fortress of the Bear, and may have been the historical source for Arthur's name. His father Aenion Urth ruled around the same time as the supposed Ambrosius, and the genealogies link them directly to Uther Pendragon and the royal house of North Wales. Archaeological traces, such as the late 5th century Penmachno stone, inscribed Vendotus, confirm an organized kingdom strong enough to defend itself. It is unlikely that such leaders would have turned to a Roman outsider for command. When Vortigern of Powys invited Saxons to fight off northern raiders, those invaders were almost certainly Picts, or the Venicones, pushing south under Kuneda. In the ensuing decades, the Venadotei, under their own commanders, defeated both Saxons and Picts, perhaps culminating in the famous victory later remembered as Mount Badon. The cultural thread tying these peoples together was Celtic, not Latin. In early Welsh sources, Prydain or Prydian meant the northern realm beyond the Forth and Clyde, land of the Picts, called Prydain, and their tongue was a branch of Brittonic, close to Welsh and Cornish. If Picts and Britons shared this linguistic and ancestral link, then Arthur, king of the Britons, stands within their native tradition, not Rome's. Monastic writers like Gildas may have elevated a Romanized champion to fit Christian ideals, but the living memory in Wales and the North preserved a different hero, a pagan or semi-pagan warlord of Brittonic stock who embodied local unity and defiance. In that light, the figure later known as King Arthur was far less a surviving Roman and far more a native leader whose legend blended history, myth, and faith into Britain's enduring national myth. A legend about Saint Padarn reveals much about the dark reputation of Maelgwn, king of Gwynedd. It tells how Maelgwn, believing that the bishop possessed a great treasure, plotted to deceive him. He sent messengers carrying sacks filled with stones and moss, claiming they contained gold that needed safekeeping during his campaign. When they returned and accused Padarn of theft, the saint was forced to prove his innocence through a trial by ordeal. Both parties plunged their arms into boiling water, and after healing, only Padarn's wounds had miraculously closed. The king, shamed by this divine judgment, confessed his deceit and granted land to Padarn as penance. Yet this episode reflects more than royal greed. It hints at the moral decline of Maelgwn, remembered by chroniclers as Maglocanus, a ruler infamous for cruelty and ambition. According to later traditions, he even murdered his uncle Owain Danwyn, identified by some modern researchers as the true historical Arthur. David Sims suggested that Maelgwn might in fact have inspired the figure of Mordred, the treacherous son who kills his father in the Arthurian cycle. Such a parallel would make sense if Owain had achieved the kind of power and influence that threatened his nephew's throne. Gildas, writing in the 6th century, condemned Maelgwn's family in fierce terms. He also denounced Owain's son, Tsinlas the Red, calling him bear rider and charioteer of many, a clear reference to the bear symbol linked to Arthur's name. It is therefore difficult to imagine Gildas glorifying this dynasty. For him, the descendants of Kuneda, possibly of northern, even Pictish origin, were savage invaders, while Ambrosius Aurelianus represented divine order and moral virtue. Nennius, however, while acknowledging Ambrosius as a great Briton king, stopped short of crediting him with the victory at Mount Badon. It is possible that both Gildas and Nennius built the image of Ambrosius from an older model, perhaps the Romanized Briton Rhyothemus, who ruled in the mid-5th century and was last recorded in the Burgundian town of Avalon, a name that eerily recalls Avalon. The Church's admiration for Rome may have led Christian writers to elevate these imperial figures as moral heroes battling paganism in post-Roman Britain, contrasting their righteousness with the independence and pagan traditions of native rulers like Kuneda's heirs. Yet even Gildas's testimony leaves room for doubt. Adam Ardrey suggested that Gildas's phrasing might not clearly name Ambrosius as the victor of Baden, only that the victory occurred after his time. If so, the credit might belong elsewhere, to local leaders of Gwynedd, rather than to a Roman general. Later, historians such as Graham Phillips and Martin Keatman argued that the historical Arthur was none other than Owain Danwyn, son of Einion Urth, known in legend as Uther Pendragon. Their interpretation of De Excidio Britannia implies that after Cadwallon Lawhire's death, Maelgwyn seized power from Owain rather than from his own father, making him the usurper and murderer remembered as Mordred. This feud continued into the next generation, when Gildas denounced Owain's son Sinless for tyranny. The legends of Arthur's sword also find echoes in this family history. The weapon Dyrnwyn, or White Hilt, belonged to the tales of the sons of Melgwyn's rivals. It blazed with fire when drawn, and granted strength to the worthy, while consuming the unworthy, an image that later evolved into the legend of Excalibur. Though some modern scholars mistakenly identified Owain Danwyn as a king of the northern Votadini, the evidence instead points to the Venadotei of North Wales. Both Owain and his brother Cadwallon Lawhire ruled in Gwynedd during the age of the Saxon Wars, and their line, marked by ambition, rivalry, and moral downfall, seems to have shaped the foundations of the Arthurian legend itself. Eochaid mac Irc is remembered in Irish tradition as the last ruler of the Fir Bolg, one of the earliest peoples said to inhabit Ireland. According to myth, their ancestors came from Scythia, a vast region north of the Black Sea bridging Europe and Asia. Modern interpretations suggest that the Fir Bolg were not a purely mythical race, but rather a reflection of Ireland's pre-Celtic inhabitants, tribes who settled the island before the arrival of the Gaels. Among these early groups were the Menapai, a Belgic people from Gaul mentioned by Ptolemy in the 2nd century AD. Their name appears as Manapi, and they are believed to have settled in the southeastern parts of Ireland. The Menapai were closely related to the Veneti of Armorica, sharing the same seafaring and trading traditions that had spread their influence across Europe since at least the 3rd century BC. It is therefore plausible that the Veneti themselves established colonies along Ireland's northern coasts, particularly in Donegal, where ancient sources mention a tribe called the Venicones, likely an overseas offshoot of the Armorican Veneti. The Irish annals even note that the Veneti of Armorica, being skilled sailors, may have been among the founders of the Fir Bolg colonies in Ireland. This idea is not far-fetched, given the maritime expansion of many ancient peoples, including the Greeks, Phoenicians, and Romans. The Veneti, known throughout Europe as expert navigators and traders, could easily have been part of this Atlantic network. In the mythological sequence, the Fir Bolg were eventually defeated by the Tuatha de Danan, a divine race who, like them, descended from the followers of Nemed, an ancient leader who had led his people from Scythia to Ireland after the Great Flood. Forced by calamities and enemies to abandon the island, Nemed's descendants were said to have migrated to distant northern isles before returning as the Tuatha de Danan. The name Tuatha resembles the Venetic tuta, meaning people, and Danu, the name of their goddess, derives from the ancient root Da'an, found in many Indo-European river names. Danu was the mother goddess of the Tuatha de Danan, a divine figure whose name recalls the Vedic Danu of India, mother of the serpent Vrtra, slain by Indra. The parallel between the Irish and Indian myths suggests a deep Indo-European link. Both traditions speak of the children of Danu as semi-divine beings associated with primordial waters and creation. In Greece, too, the Danaoi, the Achaeans of Homer's Iliad, and Danae, the mother of Perseus, preserve the same root, implying an ancient cultural memory that spread across continents. Within Irish lore, the Tuatha de Danan were the radiant gods of the island, and their myths included other Venetic elements, such as the goddess Brigid, alongside their emblematic sacred swans, creatures linked to transformation and purity. The Tuatha de Danan were said to have possessed 4 sacred treasures, each symbolizing power and divine authority. The first was the Lia Fáil, or Stone of Destiny, which could supernaturally confirm the rightful king of Ireland. The second was the Sword of Nuada, known as the Claiom Sole, or Sword of Light, which guaranteed victory to its bearer. The third was the Spear of Lugh, the northern god often equated with Mercury Artios, the protector of the bear, and revered under the epithet Teutates, meaning man of the tribe. The final object was Dagda's cauldron, the great vessel of abundance that could feed all without ever being emptied. This magical cauldron, sometimes used as a sheath for Lugh's spear dripping with blood, was regarded as the prototype of the Grail, embodying renewal and sustenance. The Dagda, patriarch of the gods, was said to dwell in the northern fortress of Aileach, in the region later known as Inishowen, where his son was buried beneath the royal stronghold. From there, his descendants, MacQuill, MacSect, and MacGrine, ruled Ireland in succession. Classical sources like Ptolemy recorded this northern residence on their maps, placing it exactly where the Iron Age fortress known today as Grian of Aileach still stands. Perched high above the bays of Lough Foyle and Lough Swilly in County Donegal, its circular stone walls form an impressive ring 5 meters tall and 4 meters thick, enclosing a broad inner space that resembles an ancient amphitheater. Medieval accounts describe the structure as magnificent, adorned with red stone, gold, bronze, and gems that gleamed day and night. Centuries later, around 320 AD, an architect named Frigrind is said to have rebuilt it after marrying Aileach, a princess from Alba. The fortress became the seat of Ulster's kings, and later the royal residence of Ireland's early high kings. Even in ruins, Grian of Aileach preserves the aura of Ireland's mythic dawn, a place where the divine Tuatha de Danan, the Fir Bolg, and the echoes of the ancient Veneti still seem to converge under the Atlantic sky. In his Topographia Hiberniae, Giraldus Cambrensis recorded one of the most striking ancient Irish coronation rites. Among the Clan Canaille of Donegal, a new king was symbolically united with a white mare in a ritual act of fertility and sovereignty. The animal was then sacrificed and boiled, and while the people feasted on its flesh, the king bathed in the steaming broth before drinking from it, sealing his union with the land. This extraordinary ceremony mirrors the ancient Indo-Aryan Ashvamedha ritual described in the Vedic texts, in which a white stallion was suffocated, its body symbolically united with the queen, and its sacrifice sanctified the divine legitimacy of kingship. Such parallels suggest a shared Indo-European origin of royal rites, that linked kingship, fertility, and cosmic renewal. In the region of ancient Donegal, near the Boreum promontory, Ptolemy's 2nd century map identifies a people called the Venicones, or Venecni. Their name unmistakably connects them to the Veneti of Brittany and to the Venicones of eastern Scotland, indicating a broad network of related Venetic communities stretching across the Celtic world. The Venecnes lineage seems to have survived in later groups known as the Winducati, who lived near modern Dunfanaghy on Sheephaven Bay. The Irish form Dun Fionnacaid may in fact derive from Dunon Winducachon, fort of the Winducati, according to Alan Mac an Baird. These Winducati were the forerunners of the clan Duach, ancestral to the rulers of the Gaul and Irgo kingdoms, and part of the wider Conail dynasty. Ethnically, they belonged to the Cruithni, the early Brittonic inhabitants of northern Ireland, who by the late Roman era had become completely Gaelicized. Despite later attempts to link them with the Uí Néill dynasty and Niall of the Nine Hostages, the evidence suggests that their true descent came from the older Venetichni line. One of their most celebrated ancestors was Conall Gulban, a 5th century leader of the clan Coné, and likely a direct descendant of this ancient Venetic stock. When these Venetic-named peoples, the Veneti of Armorica, the Venicones of Scotland, and the Venecni of Ireland, are considered together, they form a cultural chain that cannot easily be dismissed as coincidence. Each region they inhabited later became rich in Arthurian associations. Brittany, with its legends of Lancelot and Broceliande, Wales with its heroic tales of the Venadotei, and Scotland with the traditions surrounding Stirling and the Venicones. Remarkably, Donegal stands out as the only county in Ireland, out of 32, where such a Venetic name survives. The statistical unlikelihood of this convergence strengthens the suspicion that there may be a genuine link between the Veneti and the Arthurian cycle. English historian Dane Pestano, in King Arthur, in the pseudo-historical tradition, advanced this argument further by comparing the legend of King Arthur with the saga of Muirchertach mac Aircha, a 6th century Irish king who ruled from the fortress of Aileach in Donegal. His story bears an uncanny resemblance to that of the Welsh Arthur. Muirchertach, whose name mac Aircha contains the Indo-European root artco, meaning bear, reigned between roughly 510 and 537, the same era traditionally assigned to Arthur's life and death. Like the British hero, he was said to die a triple death, a motif that echoes Arthur's mystical slumber in Avalon. Muirchertach mac Aircha was celebrated as the first Christian king of Ireland, embodying justice and divine kingship, and his son Constantine parallels the Arthurian royal lineage. In certain later Scottish versions, both Arthur and mac Aircha even marry the daughter of a Frankish king. Mac Aircha's wife, Dwynsetch, shares the linguistic root Gwen with Guinevere, while one of his earlier wives was named Baden, recalling Mount Baden, site of Arthur's legendary victory over the Saxons. Both rulers commanded great armies and fought similar enemies, and a medieval manuscript, Dido Perceval, even places Arthur's final battle not in Britain, but in Ireland itself. Such striking correspondences make it plausible that Muirchertach mac Aircha was remembered by the Irish as their own Arthur, a reflection of a pan-Celtic heroic archetype that transcended regional boundaries. The Venicones of Donegal, heirs of the maritime Veneti and distant cousins of the Venicones, could thus have carried into Ireland not only their name, but also the seeds of an enduring legend. The myth of the noble warrior king who defends his people, unites the land, and vanishes into the mists of immortality. Colin Mael Maith, who lived around the early 12th century, is traditionally recognized as the father of Tavis, the figure often credited with founding the noble clan MacTavish of the Scottish Highlands. Yet the roots of the clan reach back much further than local folklore suggests. The MacTavishes trace their ancestry to ancient Irish and Venetic origins recorded in the Irish Annals and in the Ceart Uí Neill document from Donegal. Their lineage is thought to descend from the Windukati, a branch of the Senel Conel, one of the royal lines of Tir Conel, the early kingdom covering much of modern Donegal. Classical sources, such as Ptolemy, identified the tribe of the Venicones in this same region, connecting them with the greater Venetic family that stretched across northern Europe. Medieval genealogies, though often distorted by bardic invention, linked Colin Mael Maith, and thus the MacTavishes, to the legendary King Arthur, a claim also found in the 17th century genealogy of the Campbells. While the historical accuracy of this document is doubtful, its reference to Arthurian ancestry reflects a persistent cultural memory of noble descent from ancient Celtic kings. The deeper lineage of the MacTavish line can be reconstructed through several stages. The tribe of the Veneti gave rise to the clan Coney through their king Conall Gulban, founder of Tir Coney, who died in the 5th century. A later branch, the Senel Enduach, or Windukati, ruled the peninsulas of Rossguil and Irguil, forming the royal families of Donegal. Members of this group eventually migrated to western Scotland around the late 9th century and settled in the ancient kingdom of Dalriata, whose heartland lay in Argyll, with its capital at Dunad. The people of this region were known as Scots or Scotti, a term meaning invaders, which was first applied to settlers crossing from Ireland during the final years of Roman Britain. Modern genetic studies support the long-standing cultural link between Ireland and Scotland. The MacTavish lineage, like many Gaelic clans, is characterized by the R1b haplogroup, common across Western Europe, and distinct from the Eastern Venetic R1, a type. This genetic similarity reveals how close the Donegal and Pictish populations were in origin, preserving the ancient connections between the Atlantic Veneti and the early Celtic peoples of Britain. The Veneti were described as fearless warriors and accomplished seafarers who invoked the divine protection of the Dioscuri before setting out across the ocean. In Roman and Greek writings, the inhabitants of Britain appear under related names: Britons, Prytani, Cruithni, or Fridani, all descending from the same linguistic root, the same root found in the name of the Venetic goddess, Rhaetia. A similar pattern is visible in the name of the Celtic goddess Bridget, whose root corresponds closely to Rhaetia's. Both deities represent different expressions of a shared Indo-European divinity of light and wisdom. Bridget was probably once a solar goddess, as Irish legends tell that she was born at sunrise with a pillar of flame rising from her forehead. Her cult extended across the Celtic world. In Wales, she was called Bright or Freyed, in Brittany Brigantis, in Scotland Brid or Bride, and in Ireland Brigid or Bry, where she was said to be the daughter of Dagda. Like Rhaetia, Bridget's worship became widespread and enduring, giving her name to many places, from the Scottish town of Brechin to the rivers Brynt and Brent in Wales and England, and even the river Brenta in northern Italy. Roman religion later identified Bridget and Brigantia with Minerva, a goddess of wisdom and the arts, mirroring Rhaetia's own association with Athena. Archaeological remains across Britain confirm this syncretism. A bronze bust of Minerva was found in the Roman fort of Cardian in Angus. A grand temple to her stood in Bath, and near Hadrian's Wall, a shrine at Caraburg dedicated to Coventina and Minerva marked the sacred connection between wells, springs, and divine knowledge. Thus, through myth, genealogy, and even bloodlines, the story of the clan MacTavish and its ancestral kin preserves echoes of the ancient Venetic world and the spiritual legacy that linked Ireland, Scotland, and continental Europe in a shared cultural continuum. The surviving Venetic texts consist mainly of short inscriptions, often no longer than a few words, found on votive objects and tombstones. Yet, despite their brevity, linguists have managed to extract important grammatical features from them. In the mid-20th century, Hans Krahe identified 7 linguistic traits that helped place Venetic within the Indo-European family, arguing that it represented a distinct branch of its own. Later, Gvozdanovich re-evaluated these features and showed that 4 of them align closely with Celtic languages, 3 with Italic, and 1 with Germanic. A grammatical ending once thought unique to Venetic, the dash to suffix used in the third-person singular, was later found to correspond to the Celtic T preterite. This discovery strengthened the argument that Venetic was more closely related to Celtic than to Italic. Building on this evidence, Gvozdanovich proposed that Venetic should be classified directly within the Celtic group, a view that contrasted with the traditional stance of many Italian scholars. Earlier, Lejeune had already pointed out that the religious and political vocabulary of Venetic shared few similarities with Latin, but displayed striking affinities with Northern Indo-European traditions, as seen in the Venetic term Aisu for God, related to the Norse Aesir and the Vedic Asura. Venetic and Celtic also share key structural isoglosses, including a preference for verb second-word order and a consonant system that contrasts tense and lax forms. However, Celtic itself was far from uniform, encompassing diverse dialects across Europe. Linguistic comparison shows that Venetic most closely resembles the Brythonic branch of Celtic, languages such as Breton and Welsh, rather than the continental Celtic spoken in the Po Valley. The similarities between Venetic and the Breton dialect of Venadotei are particularly notable, suggesting a historical link between these speech communities. Indeed, many shared words and grammatical patterns are too numerous and systematic to be mere coincidences. Since the Veneti were an older seafaring civilization that had established themselves along the Atlantic long before the Celtic migrations reached those shores, it is likely that Brythonic absorbed elements of Venetic, not the other way around. This view is supported by Tacitus, who observed that the language spoken in Britain resembled that of the Baltic Maeatae, a non-Celtic people, implying an ancient northern connection. Tacitus's account carries special weight given his close relationship to Britain's Roman governor Agricola, whose campaigns brought him deep into the island. This lends credibility to the idea that Britain once hosted a linguistic landscape more varied than pure Celtic. Following this logic, Gvozdanovich identified the Venetese dialect as a living remnant of the Venetic-Brythonic transition. Venetese exhibits distinctive features such as palatalization and consonant softening, which recall developments in early Slavic languages, and Kenneth Jackson also noted its preservation of ancient phonetic traits. From this, an ethnographic picture emerges. The Venetic peoples, particularly along the Atlantic seaboard, may have played a formative role in shaping what became the broader family of Brittonic-speaking peoples across Brittany, Cornwall, and Wales. The evolution of Brythonic follows the maritime movements of the Atlantic Veneti. It first flourished in Brittany and then spread north along coastal routes to Cornwall, Wales, and eventually Scotland. Its speakers, being sailors and traders, carried their language by sea before it gradually moved inland. By the 5th century, Brythonic began to give way to Irish Gaelic and later to the languages of Germanic and Norse settlers. Only in Wales and Cornwall did Brythonic persist as a living tongue, while in Armorica it survived until the early medieval period, overlapping with the rise of Arthurian tradition. Because both Breton and Welsh descended from Brythonic, they remained mutually intelligible until the late Middle Ages. There is also evidence that Brythonic extended to Scotland, particularly among the Venicones, as shown by the presence of numerous Brythonic place names in their former territory. Even the name of King Kuneda may derive from the Brythonic Kunodagos, meaning good hound. Kenneth Jackson suggested that the Picts spoke a Gallo-Brythonic dialect, classifying them as P-Celtic speakers, and this view aligns with archaeological and linguistic traces found in their homeland. The Picts used an early writing system known as Ogham, a script formed from groups of carved lines representing different sounds rather than letters of distinct shapes. Meanwhile, the Gaels, Celtic-speaking peoples who had long inhabited Ireland, began settling in western Scotland around the 5th century, establishing the kingdom of Dal Riata. Their speech, the Gaelic of Ulster, remains today in Donegal and closely resembles Scottish Gaelic. These migrations led to the gradual displacement of the Picts and the filling of the political void left after Rome's withdrawal. Linguistically, the Adriatic Venetic shares fewer traits with Gaelic than with Brythonic, reflecting their distinct origins within the Celtic family. This fundamental division underscores that Brythonic was the older and more conservative branch of Celtic, preserving many features akin to those found in West Slavic languages such as Polish and Czech. Through this linguistic and cultural lens, Venetic appears not as a peripheral dialect, but as a key ancestor of the Atlantic Celtic world. In ancient Scotland, the stone of Manau in Clackmannan was revered as a sacred relic by the Maeatae and Venicones tribes, who associated it with the sea god Manannan. This name evokes echoes of older lunar and northern deities such as Men, the Minotaur, and Menulus. Over time, many other stones across Scotland gained legendary status. One of these, a massive granite boulder in Galloway Forest Park, became known as the Stone of King Robert Bruce, marking his victory over the English in 1307. Yet the most celebrated of all was the Stone of Destiny, an object wrapped in mystery and regarded as a divine symbol of royal power and national identity. Tradition claims it was brought from Ireland to the Isle of Iona, later housed in Dunstafnage Castle, and finally moved to Scone in 843 by Synod MacAlpin, the first king of the United Scots and Picts. According to legend, Macbeth, a descendant of MacAlpin, later hid the true stone within his fortress, replacing it with a copy. The Stone of Destiny, known in Gaelic as Lia Fá, symbolized the continuity of kingship and the divine right to rule. Its journey from Ireland to Scotland mirrored the migration of the Gaels themselves, linking it deeply to their myth of origin. Before the arrival of the Gaels, Scone had already been a political and religious center for the Picts, where their kings were likely inaugurated. When the Gaels absorbed Pictish territory, they also adopted the rituals associated with the sacred stone to legitimize their rule. The prophecy connected to the stone foretold that whoever possessed it would reign wherever it rested, turning it into one of the most coveted relics of power. Its size and shape suggest it could have served as a throne on which early kings sat during their inauguration rather than being crowned. Scone's choice as the royal seat was a deliberate act of political symbolism. By establishing their court on sacred Pictish ground, the Gaels aligned themselves with the older traditions of the land and thus secured greater acceptance among the local population. The site of Moot Hill, near Scone Palace, carried deep cosmological meaning, representing the world's center and the connection between earth and heaven. For the Picts of the Venicones region, Scone stood at the heart of Gowrie, encircled by the provinces of Angus, Fife, Strathearn, and Atholl. Even after the Gaelic expansion toward the eastern coast, Scone retained its sacred significance as the spiritual core of the new Scottish kingdom. The later kings of England understood this power of symbolism well. From 1603 onward, following the union of the crowns, they too were crowned upon the Scottish stone in an attempt to claim its legitimacy. Queen Elizabeth II revived this ancient tradition in 1953, continuing the association between the monarchy and the mystique of the stone. The Stone of Destiny's story also includes centuries of conflict and exile. In 1296, Edward I of England seized it as a political trophy, transporting it to Westminster Abbey and encasing it within a wooden coronation throne that became central to English royal ceremonies. For 700 years, it remained in London until 1996, when it was triumphantly returned to Scotland and placed in Edinburgh Castle with the consent of Prime Minister John Major. Scientific analysis later revealed that the stone was quarried from eastern Perthshire, confirming its origin near Scone and aligning both geological and historical evidence with the local traditions that called it the Eastern Stone in an old Gaelic poem from around 1060. The veneration of a royal stone was not unique to Scotland. Across the Celtic and Atlantic worlds, stones served as thrones for kings, imbued with sacred authority. The Irish monarchs, for instance, were enthroned upon stones outdoors, symbolizing their divine right to rule. Some Scottish stones bore footprints, and only the rightful king's foot would perfectly fit, echoing the mythical proof of legitimacy in the story of Cinderella. This same sacred symbolism appears in the Arthurian legend of the sword embedded in stone, a test that only the true king, chosen by destiny, could overcome. The sword, emerging from the stone, mirrors the axis mundi, the link between heaven and earth, and signifies that only the ruler in harmony with this cosmic axis possessed the wisdom to lead his people. In this context, figures such as Merlin embody the essential guidance of foresight, the ability to discern the rightful path for the realm and secure a just future for all. The true origins of Merlin, the legendary wizard of Arthurian tradition, remain shrouded in mystery. Historical evidence suggests that the character may have emerged from the fusion of two real 6th century bards whose lives and stories later blended into a single mythic figure. The first, known as Myrddin, served at the court of Gwendoলাই ap Teidio, a pagan ruler who governed the Britons of Arfderydd Castle in the region of present-day Arthuret and Carlisle. When Gwendoলাই was defeated and slain around 573 by Christian kings, Myrddin was overcome by grief and retreated into the forest of Caledonia, where, according to Geoffrey of Monmouth's Vita Merlini, he lived in madness and solitude, tormented by memories of war and loss. His sister Gwendid and wife Gwendolen bear names with a distinctly ancient northern resonance, adding to the sense of a distant pre-Christian world. The second bard, Taliesin, lived during roughly the same era and is regarded as the earliest Welsh poet whose authentic works survive. His poems, rich in mythic and symbolic imagery, connect him closely to the spiritual world of early Britain. In The Spoils of Anwethan, Taliesin accompanies Arthur on a mystical voyage to the otherworld, where they seize the enchanted cauldron, an early prototype of the Grail. Similar motifs appear in the Welsh tale of Branwen, where the magical cauldron restores the dead to life. Later traditions portray Taliesin as Arthur's chief bard, as in Culhwch ac Olwen, while Geoffrey of Monmouth reimagines him as a close companion of Myrddin, helping escort Arthur's body to Avalon after the final battle of Camlan. He is even said to have aided Myrddin during his madness and shared a hermit's life with him in the forests of the north. Taliesin's poetry reveals deep ties to the royal house of Kuneda, the founder of the Welsh kingdom of Venadotei. In his verses, he praises the tribe that rules the land, a clear homage to Kuneda's descendants. An elegy dedicated to Kuneda bears the stylistic hallmarks of Taliesin's authorship, expressing profound mourning for the king's death around 460. The bard's association with Kuneda's son, Einion, a ruler of Gwynedd, whose name was later linked to the legendary Uther Pendragon, strengthens the connection between historical Welsh dynasties and Arthurian legend. Taliesin himself owned lands in Arlechfed, in northwest Wales, which were confiscated by Maelgwn, Prince of Venadotei. In retaliation, the bard composed a fierce invective against Maelgwn, cursing him with the Yellow Plague that, according to tradition, struck his kingdom in the form of a serpent. Gildas, writing in the same century, described Maelgwn as a tyrant who had murdered his uncle Owain Danwyn, ruler of Rhos, an act that later storytellers transformed into the betrayal of King Arthur. Over time, Maelgwn evolved within legend into Medraut, Arthur's treacherous adversary at the Battle of Camlan, while in Geoffrey's Historia Regum Britannia, he became the son of King Lot among the northern Votadini. Through these transformations, the boundaries between history and myth blurred, and the bards Myrddin and Taliesin, one tormented by war, the other devoted to sacred kingship, merged to form the enduring figure of Merlin, the prophet and sage whose voice bridges the worlds of poetry, magic, and memory. In the Arthurian tradition, the motif of the swan appears repeatedly as a sacred and symbolic creature connected with the sea, transformation, and divine purity. Lohengrin, the son of Parsifal and thus a descendant of the Venadotei, was said to have arrived from the sea to rescue the young Duchess Elsa of Brabant on a vessel drawn by a swan. This image echoes throughout the medieval Arthurian cycle. In La Première Continuation du Roman de Perceval, a knight is carried away on a small boat pulled by a swan that vanishes back into the sea, while in the tale of the Lady of the Lake, the ship sent for Arthur bears engravings of a woman and 2 swan wings. Even Arthur's helmet, according to Llayamon's Brut, bore the name Goswif, meaning white goose, linking him once more to the same celestial bird. Arthur's mother, Igraine, recalls the old Irish term for goose, further emphasizing this avian symbolism. The writer Robert Graves associated the swan with the goddess Bridget, whose sacred animal in Gaelic Scotland was the white swan. He saw in her an ancient maritime counterpart of the Aegean goddess Brizo, who was honored by offerings of small boats and known for granting prophetic dreams concerning navigation and fishing. The swan was equally sacred in early Irish myth. The god Oengus, a member of the divine Tuatha de Danan and son of the Dagda and Boann, was said to transform into a swan. Known as the youthful god of love and poetry, Oengus's birth itself was miraculous, for his father halted the sun to conceal his union with Boann until their child was born. His beloved Caer Ibormith was a maiden who could become a swan at Samhain, the festival marking the threshold between worlds. Bound by a prophecy foretelling his death on her wedding day, Caer's father refused their marriage. Yet when the veil between worlds thinned on the 1st of November, Angus found her by a lake where hundreds of maidens had been transformed into swans and chained in pairs. Only Caer's golden chain revealed her identity, and when Angus recognized her, he too took swan form, and the lovers flew away together above the waters, their song so beautiful that all who heard it fell into an enchanted sleep lasting 3 days and nights. Echoes of this mythic symbolism appear in the material culture of the ancient Veneti. Archaeologists discovered a bronze situla at Posmon, near Montebelluna Hill, dating to the early Iron Age, whose engraved scenes depict the daily and ritual life of the Venetic people. Divided into 3 bands, the images reveal much about their society. The upper band shows a solemn equestrian procession of noble figures and chariots, symbolizing both status and the idea of a sacred journey. The middle section portrays a vivid celebration with athletic games, music, wine, and scenes of love, all centered around a great cauldron that serves as the focus of ritual purification and fertility. The cauldron, which holds wine offered in libation, represents the vessel of life, its hollow form likened to the womb, while the ladle pouring the sacred liquid evokes male energy. The lower band depicts hunting scenes, including deer and boar, which likely carried sacrificial and initiatory meanings similar to the ancient Greek rituals of Artemis, where young girls performed as little bears before marriage in rites of transformation. The sacred cauldron of the Venadotei closely parallels the mythical cauldron sought by Arthur in the Spoils of Anwfn from the Book of Taliesin, described as a shining vessel rimmed with pearls, hidden in the other world across the sea. It was in this mystical realm that Morgan, the goddess of Anduin, was said to take Arthur to the Isle of Apples, Avalon, to heal his wounds. Later, Christianized retellings transformed this cauldron into the Holy Grail, linking it to the legend of Joseph of Arimathea, who preserved the blood and water from Christ's body in a sacred cup. Medieval writers such as Robert de Boron reinterpreted the ancient Celtic vessel of renewal into the Christian chalice, blending pagan myth with Christian doctrine. Yet beneath the later layers of theology, the Grail remains a continuation of the ancient Venetic and Celtic symbol of the cauldron, a vessel of divine nourishment, resurrection, and the eternal cycle of life and love, much like the swans that once carried the souls of gods and heroes across the waters of the other world. On the lower band of the Posmon situla, a rural figure appears, a man wearing a conical headdress and holding a plow while guiding an ox with a whip. This scene, along with depictions of coupling, echoes similar motifs found on other Venetic situlas, such as the one from San Zeno, revealing a consistent symbolic language in their art. Comparable imagery can be seen on the Benvenuti situla, a 6th century masterpiece of Attestine craftsmanship, which portrays a servant attempting to sell a horse to a seated nobleman holding a cup of libation, as well as 2 boxers competing for a helmeted prize. The Vace situla, discovered near Ljubljana, repeats the same ceremonial pattern. A mounted procession of knights, libation rituals, and a central figure wielding a double-headed scepter shaped like birds, a clear symbol of the solar boat or celestial journey. Another situla, preserved today in the Rhode Island School of Design Museum, shows fighters and a prize cauldron whose symmetrical form resembles the curve of a swan's neck, blending artistry with cosmic symbolism. Although such artifacts display traces of Etruscan influence, they belong firmly to Venetic tradition, reflecting a world view that merged earthly life with sacred continuity. The story of Heraclea, a city that later became the cradle of Venice, can be seen as a continuation of this ancient vitality. Archaeological and literary traces suggest that the settlement emerged unexpectedly following the conquest of Oderzo by the Lombard king Rotari around the time of Emperor Heraclius's death in the 7th century. The first historical mention of Heraclea appears in a papal decree of 640, which established new dioceses in the Lagoon region. Yet the roots of the area stretch far deeper. Long before the Christian era, the 60 or so islands scattered between the Adige and Isonzo rivers were inhabited by industrious fishing and trading communities. Heraclea grew on one of these, the island of Melitissa, a place of natural beauty surrounded by dunes, pine forests, and nesting seabirds. The lagoon's channels linked these islands with the mainland city of Oderzo, whose harbor at Melitissa had already served as a commercial outpost in antiquity. Echoes of this mythic symbolism appear in the material culture of the ancient Veneti. Archaeologists discovered a bronze situla at Posmon, near Montebelluna Hill, dating to the early Iron Age, whose engraved scenes depict the daily and ritual life of the Venetic people. Divided into 3 bands, the images reveal much about their society. The upper band shows a solemn equestrian procession of noble figures and chariots, symbolizing both status and the idea of a sacred journey. The middle section portrays a vivid celebration with athletic games, music, wine, and scenes of love, all centered around a great cauldron that serves as the focus of ritual purification and fertility. The cauldron, which holds wine offered in libation, represents the vessel of life, its hollow form likened to the womb, while the ladle pouring the sacred liquid evokes male energy. The lower band depicts hunting scenes, including deer and boar, which likely carried sacrificial and initiatory meanings similar to the ancient Greek rituals of Artemis, where young girls performed as little bears before marriage in rites of transformation. The sacred cauldron of the Venadotei closely parallels the mythical cauldron sought by Arthur in the Spoils of Anwfn from the Book of Taliesin, described as a shining vessel rimmed with pearls, hidden in the other world across the sea. It was in this mystical realm that Morgan, the goddess of Andoin, was said to take Arthur to the Isle of Apples, Avalon, to heal his wounds. Later, Christianized retellings transformed this cauldron into the Holy Grail, linking it to the legend of Joseph of Arimathea, who preserved the blood and water from Christ's body in a sacred cup. Medieval writers such as Robert de Boron reinterpreted the ancient Celtic vessel of renewal into the Christian chalice, blending pagan myth with Christian doctrine. Yet beneath the later layers of theology, the Grail remains a continuation of the ancient Venetic and Celtic symbol of the cauldron, a vessel of divine nourishment, resurrection, and the eternal cycle of life and love, much like the swans that once carried the souls of gods and heroes across the waters of the other world. On the lower band of the Posmon situla, a rural figure appears, a man wearing a conical headdress and holding a plow while guiding an ox with a whip. This scene, along with depictions of coupling, echoes similar motifs found on other Venetic situlas, such as the one from San Zeno, revealing a consistent symbolic language in their art. Comparable imagery can be seen on the Benvenuti situla, a 6th century masterpiece of Attestine craftsmanship, which portrays a servant attempting to sell a horse to a seated nobleman holding a cup of libation, as well as 2 boxers competing for a helmeted prize. The Vace situla, discovered near Ljubljana, repeats the same ceremonial pattern. A mounted procession of knights, libation rituals, and a central figure wielding a double-headed scepter shaped like birds, a clear symbol of the solar boat or celestial journey. Another situla, preserved today in the Rhode Island School of Design Museum, shows fighters and a prize cauldron whose symmetrical form resembles the curve of a swan's neck, blending artistry with cosmic symbolism. Although such artifacts display traces of Etruscan influence, they belong firmly to Venetic tradition, reflecting a world view that merged earthly life with sacred continuity. The story of Heraclea, a city that later became the cradle of Venice, can be seen as a continuation of this ancient vitality. Archaeological and literary traces suggest that the settlement emerged unexpectedly following the conquest of Oderzo by the Lombard king Rotari around the time of Emperor Heraclius's death in the 7th century. The first historical mention of Heraclea appears in a papal decree of 640, which established new dioceses in the Lagoon region. Yet the roots of the area stretch far deeper. Long before the Christian era, the 60 or so islands scattered between the Adige and Isonzo rivers were inhabited by industrious fishing and trading communities. Heraclea grew on one of these, the island of Melitissa, a place of natural beauty surrounded by dunes, pine forests, and nesting seabirds. The lagoon's channels linked these islands with the mainland city of Oderzo, whose harbor at Melitissa had already served as a commercial outpost in antiquity. As Roman power weakened, waves of invaders, Visigoths, Huns, Vandals, Ostrogoths, and Lombards swept across northern Italy, forcing the local population to seek refuge in the lagoons. Each mainland town found a corresponding sanctuary. Aquileia's people moved to Grado, those of Altinum to Torcello, Concordia to Caorla, and the citizens of Oderzo fled to Melitissa. Over time, Melitissa evolved from a haven into a thriving maritime hub, sustained by trade with the East and protected by its strategic waterways. Tradition holds that as early as the 2nd century, the entire population of Oderzo relocated there to escape Germanic raids, making the early Venetians descendants of the Baltic traders who once founded the markets of Opitergium. By the 5th century, a cluster of flourishing lagoon towns, Grado, Caorle, Torcello, Malamocco, Chioggia, and Melitissa, had formed around Rialto, the future heart of Venice. Cassiodorus, minister to Theodoric, praised these settlers who lived like water birds, building their homes upon reeds and weaving the marshlands into firm ground. Their salt production and maritime trade brought both sustenance and wealth, while the natural barriers of the lagoon ensured their independence. By 466, the islands had organized themselves into a republic governed by tribunes, maintaining autonomy while preserving good relations with the Byzantine Empire. As the Lombards advanced inland, the lagoon settlements became a bastion of safety. Refugees from Oderzo once again fled to Melitissa, transforming it into a major center. When the river Piave altered its course, the island became a peninsula and was renamed Heraclea, in honor of Emperor Heraclius. By the mid-7th century, it had grown into a vibrant city of nearly 90,000 inhabitants, with grand churches and strong diplomatic ties to both Byzantium and the Lombard kingdom. Its cathedral, dedicated to St. Peter the Apostle, symbolized its spiritual and political strength. However, internal rivalries and external threats strained this prosperity. Conflicts with neighboring Jessalo erupted into open warfare, while raids from Dalmatian pirates ravaged its coasts. In 697, amid chaos, the people of Heraclea gathered in the cathedral and agreed to elect a single leader to restore order. Paul of Oderzo, known as Pauluccio Anafesto, became the first doge, a title that would define Venetian governance for centuries. Under the doges, Heraclea enjoyed renewed splendor and military success, including the reconquest of Ravenna from the Lombards. Yet its long feud with Jessalo reignited, and devastating wars eventually weakened both cities. Following a series of destructive conflicts and raids by the Franks, many noble families abandoned Heraclea, resettling around Rialto and Torcello. As the waterways shifted and the marshes swallowed the ruins, the city of Heraclea gradually vanished beneath the lagoon, its legacy carried onward by the people who built Venice from its memory. The worship of the sun in northern Europe began during the Middle Bronze Age and flourished in the Late Bronze Age, when images of aquatic birds appeared frequently in sacred art associated with rivers, lakes, and marshes. These twin birds, often arranged symmetrically, were symbolic guardians of the solar boat, an emblem of divine power and cosmic balance. The motif, usually featuring bird-headed prows, appeared on bronze foils and ceremonial objects made with the intricate points and studs technique, representing the deep connection between Italy and the Danube-Carpathian region in metalwork traditions from around 1000 to 800 BC. The solar boat became a sacred emblem of faith, much like the cross in Christianity or the Star of David in Judaism, recurring endlessly on ceremonial vessels, ossuaries, incense burners, and even horse equipment. Over time, horses replaced birds as symbols of the solar journey, reflecting the evolving iconography of divine travel. Evidence of this solar cult reached across Europe. In North Wales, near Taliolin Lake in the Snowdonia Mountains, a brass plaque depicting the solar boat was discovered, showing two symmetrical bird heads in Iron Age style. This finding, not far from the lake linked in legend to King Arthur's voyage to Avalon, connects ancient British religious imagery with continental symbolism. The swan, a sacred creature associated with Apollo, also appeared in myths of light and rebirth. Ancient poets likened prophetic singers and bards to swans, and it was said that flocks of them circled the island of Delos 7 times when Apollo was born. The god himself was imagined riding on a chariot or boat drawn by swans on his way to Hyperoreia, a mythical land of eternal sunlight. Archaeological parallels in the Aegean world reinforce this connection. A golden plate from the Mycenaean sanctuary of Artemis in Delos displays a boat with bird-shaped stern and prow, bearing a solar disk at its center. Similar depictions from Italy suggest a shared religious language across the Mediterranean and the Danube. Remarkably, this image appeared in the shrine of Artemis, not Apollo, hinting that the solar boat was originally linked to a female divinity, perhaps the forerunner of later goddesses of light and fertility. The continuity between the Mycenaean period and the Urnfield culture in Central Europe, active between 1200 and 1050 BC, suggests that the symbol of the solar boat may have passed between them, either from the Aegean to Central Europe or vice versa. The original Urnfield myth of the solar boat has been lost, but its essence can be compared to Egyptian cosmology, where the sun's daily journey across the sky was depicted as a voyage on two divine vessels known as the Boats of Maat. The morning boat carried the rising sun, manifest as the scarab Khepri, Ra at noon, and Atum-Ra at sunset, while the evening boat carried him through the underworld, defended by gods against the serpent of chaos, Apophis. Egyptian mythology personified the heavens as the goddess Nut, who gave birth to the sun each dawn, swallowed him at dusk, and bore him again the next morning, symbolizing rebirth and cosmic order. If myths could travel across lands and evolve through different peoples, this Egyptian story might have found an echo in the Venetic world. In such an interpretation, the two solar boats became the vessels of the goddess Rhetia, representing cosmic harmony. The morning boat carried the youthful sun as Phaethon, Helios, or Apollo, while the evening boat bore him through darkness, pursued by the serpent Python, until he triumphed by slaying the beast that had tormented his mother. This mythic framework, while not directly borrowed, reveals striking thematic continuity: the divine voyage through light and shadow, death and rebirth, chaos and renewal. Like Apollo and his initiate Orpheus, who ventured into the underworld guided only by song and devotion, these myths mirror humanity's enduring vision of a cosmic journey through darkness toward light. Hesiod's Theogony presents the Titans as the earliest gods, predating the Olympians, and echoes of their cult surface far beyond Greece. A Hittite epic parallels the tale of Uranus and Kronos with Anu and Kumarbi, while later Phrygian tradition turns to the tragic figure of Tantalus and his son Pelops. Among the Titan generation, Phoebe and Coeus beget Leto, Latona robed in blue, whose enduring worship at sanctuaries such as the Latoon in Delos links the later Apollonian religion back to a Titan substrate. Pausanias even makes Python, slain by Apollo, a child of the Titan Crius, and Orphic hymns weave Titans and Rhea into Apollo's orbit. A coherent Venetic mythology has never been systematized in mainstream scholarship. University manuals typically list Venetic deities without reconstructing their narrative web, while Greek and Roman mythologies dominate curricula and leave Veneto's ancient tradition obscure. Christianization erased much of the local pagan memory, both oral and written. Yet a wider comparative lens, one deliberately centered on Venetic perspectives, helps recover patterns and relationships others miss. Beginning with the Titan Tantalus, whose father Tmolus adjudged a musical contest between Pan and Apollo, and whose family's fortunes ranged from Lydia to Paphlagonia on the Black Sea, we find themes that foreshadow the Trojan cycle. Paphlagonia was the homeland of the Anatolian Veneti. Pelops ruled there at Anyta before the Pelopid line came to Argos, and the Iliad's layered tradition may preserve an older epic stratum in which Venetic actors clash with Aulus, the Trojan founder. Roman syncretism equated Rhetia with Minerva Athena, and the name Pallas, chief epithet of Athena, was also that of a Titan whose protective image, the Palladian, secured Troy. Ancient accounts say the Palladian dropped from the sky when Aulus founded the city. Later, myth has Odysseus steal the smallest of many copies to doom Troy. The Palladian's archaic materials, including dolphin ivory and bone associated with Pelops, further entwine Pelopid, Trojan, and Titan strands. As Apollo's Greek cult centers at Delphi and Delos crystallize in the 8th century BC, Apollo himself shows Near Eastern facets. a plague-bringer akin to the Hurrian Aplu, and a tutelary deity in Hittite treaties under the form Apollonius at Wilusa, the Troad. In the Iliad's opening, Apollo's wrath is epidemic. As a counterbalance, physician Apollo protects cities through oracles and apotropaic rites. The Titans linger at the margins of Apollonian myth. The Homeric hymn confuses Python with the Typhon of Titan lore. Leto is daughter of the Titan Koios. Orphism makes the Titans pivotal in the violent cycle of Dionysus Zagreus. Themis presides at Apollo's birth. Phoebe is remembered as founder at Delphi. Thaia bears Delphos to Apollo. Hyperion fathers the lights of sky and dawn. Climon mothers Phaethon. Boreas, the north wind, descends from Astraeus and Eos. And Hestia, firstborn of Kronos and Rhea, refuses Apollo and vows chastity. Greek authors remembered the northern Adriatic through Titan names. Aeschylus, Hesychius, and Photius call it the Gulf of Rhea. Apollonius of Rhodes has Orpheus recount an older divine order, Eurynome and Ophion, ruling before Kronos and Rhea. Archaeology and epigraphy around Verona, Trentino, Alto Adige, Altinum, and Timovo show unusual extra-Roman devotion to Saturn and Ops, Kronos and Rhea, implying a deep local antiquity for Titan cults that predates Roman influence. These threads intersect repeatedly with Venetic origins and worship. Tmolus, ancestor of Pelops, and judge in Apollo's contest with Pan, lies genealogically a few generations before the Trojan War, near the onset of Europe's Urnfield culture. In this Anatolian lattice, Apollo's earliest character appears as healer and punisher, a boundary god of pestilence and prophecy, whose cult traveled along maritime and riverine corridors the Veneti frequented. From Anatolia, Apollonian motifs plausibly reached the Baltic under the breath of the north wind, and it is noteworthy that Herodotus places the Phrygians in the Balkans before their southward move, keeping a corridor open between the Aegean and the continental north. Among the Adriatic Veneti, Apollo stood just behind Rhaetia in importance. A temple of Apono at Abano Terme is attested in the 1st century BC. Statues and dedications at Lagol in Cador and a sanctuary at Adria point to an earlier 5th century solarization of his cult. At Spina, the 6th century emporium trading amber and Venetic horses, inscriptions and offerings to Apollo were significant enough that the city dedicated a treasure at Delphi. Even small details dismissed as folk by modern writers, like setting flat loaves out for crows, echo Apollo, for the raven was his prophetic bird, and the swan his emblem of inspired song and sacred journey, the same paired swans that frame the solar boat motif. Greek filters demonized the Titans as rivals of the Olympians, but local geographies retained their names and powers. The Adriatic by Timavo was called the Sea of Kronos, with an Isle of Kronos remembered in the far Atlantic. Cold northern waters were Cronium, the Sea of Ice. A river named Tartarus meanders into the upper Adriatic through marsh and shadow. The very image of underworld streams where Kronos and Iapetus dwell. The story of Kronos' castration is placed in Ionian waters at Corcyra, also called Drepana for the sickle, while the Euboeans spoke of both Sea of Kronos and Gulf of Rhea, divine spouses mapped to the Venetic coast. In such a landscape, it is no stretch to see Rhaetia, the great lady of Este and Lagole, as the local face of Rhea, Mater Deorum. Medieval Veneto lore remembered a god, Apo, who unseated a wicked king of Carpanea, thinly veiled Apono, Apollo, suggesting a native pair of mother and youthful god functioning like Rhea and Apollo. Heracles, whose cult is well attested in the Veneto long before Romanization, threads these worlds together. He seeks counsel on the Eridanus from Nereus, slays the Ladon that guards the apples at the western edge of the world, and travels the Via Heraclea, north and west, towards the lands that later inspired the Avalon of apples. In different reckonings, the Hesperides are daughters of Atlas or Themis, keeping the myth inside Titan kinship. Prometheus and Atlas, sons of Iapetus, assist or oppose the hero, who bears the apples back through Tartarus. Heracles passes through Abano, where Geryon had an oracle and golden dice divined the future in the springs. North in Cadore, a triune deity, Trumusiate, is linked to healing waters and triple sovereignty of sky, earth, and underworld, recalling the Slavic Triglav, another sign that Venetic religion sat at a crossroads of Adriatic, Alpine, and Baltic traditions. In the tale of the Ceranian hind, the hero follows the sacred deer north through Istria toward Hyperoreia, sparing its life with a bloodless shot beside the river Ladon, near Mount Artemision, a mythic itinerary that folds Artemis, Apollo, Titans, and the far north into one continuous religious horizon. Apollon Petrus, Apollo of the Fathers, points back to a remote northern ancestry. In Greek memory, Apollo is the god of the Hyperboreans. His sacred griffins, and by extension the winged lion that later emblemized the Serenissima, may have entered the Venetic sphere through Apollonian priests who moved along northern routes. The Hyperboreans were not a literary figment. Temple inventories from Delos in the 3rd century BCE record their offerings and even note the hospitality extended to the bearers. Those gifts, carried by maidens named Arge, Opis, Hyperoque, and Laodic, and bundled in straw, may early on have been Baltic amber, the supreme votive for a god whose tears were said to fall as glowing gems when he visited the far north. Hyperborean literally means beyond Boreas, the north wind born of dawn, and the Titan Astraeus. Ancient writers placed their land somewhere past the Thracian highlands, but the earliest geographic notices, Hecataeus of Miletus in the 6th century BCE, situate them in the far north between ocean and the Riphaean mountains, a description that fits the Polish plain between the Baltic and the Black Sea watershed. Ptolemy likewise treats those mountains as the divide of the Baltic and Euxine, and he and Marcian of Heraclea call the northern waters the Hyperborean Ocean. The Orphic Argonautica has the Argo thread this northern corridor. After reaching the head of the Adriatic, a region Greeks knew as the Sea of Kronos, the ship slips through narrows into the great northern ocean that Hyperboreans themselves called the Cronian or Dead Sea. In that high latitude, near the lands of the Arimaspi, Herodotus places the Hyperboreans as the rare nation that did not prey on its neighbors. The Titan myth of Phaethon entwines these geographies. From Hesiod onward, his fall is bound to Eridanus, the river of amber that runs to the Boreal Sea. In one telling, Aphrodite takes the radiant youth into her service as night ward of her shrine. In another strand, Pythagorean lore makes his cataclysm the spark that marked the Milky Way. Eastern myth adds a further resonance, likening the morning star's proud fall to a leonine challenger of the sky god. Scholars have suggested that an early Greek catalogue of heroic women already fused Eridanus, Amber, and the Hyperboreans into a single complex. Latin poets elaborated the tale. Seeking proof of his paternity, Phaethon begs to drive the Sun team, loses control, scorches the north until ice melts, then dives too low, parching rivers and forests, until Zeus strikes him down. He plunges into Eridanus, mourned by his friend Sickness and by his sisters, the Heliades, who harden into poplars that weep amber. Ancient mythographers noticed that these Heliades overlap in name and function with the Hesperides, whose dragon Laodan was slain by Heracles. In some accounts, the Hesperides themselves become a poplar, an elm, and a willow. Other versions plant these nymphs by the Po, which they identify as Eridanus, and send Heracles to the sea god Nereus for the golden apples, just as he ranges toward the Hyperborean north after the elusive Ceryneian hind. Roman authors then anchor the whole cycle in the upper Adriatic. The Electrides, Amber Islands, lie off the Po delta. The Argonauts, after watering at Timavo, where the Dioscuri's horse drinks, turn up toward Eridanus. And a chorus of geographers, from Strabo to Pliny, ties the river's mouth and its coastal bars to this amber trade. In antiquity, those bars formed long barrier islands from Ravenna up toward the future Lido, visited by Veneti, Etruscans, and Greeks. Later, subsidence and shifting channels folded them into the mainland marsh. On this stage, a Venetic story unfolds before Etruscan ascendancy. The great workshop at Fraticina on the lower Po flourished in the 12th to 10th centuries BCE, producing glass and working bone, antler, bronze, and ceramics, and channeling amber south from the Baltic long before Etruscan settlement thickened in the 6th century. By the 8th and 7th centuries, Greek traders from Corinth, Corcyra, and Phocaea reappeared in the Adriatic. But soon enough gold displaced amber in Greek monumental art, and Etruria became the voracious consumer and carver of the northern resin. Even so, amber in burials at Este and Padua, and in sites east into Slovenia, shows that the High Adriatic received this material a century before Etruscan power peaked, implying that Veneti redirected commerce inland when overseas demand waned. Southward, the traffic likely moved by sea to Verrucchio as a staging point, and by land and river along an old delta branch that Romans later called the Padusa, and Polybius called the Padoa, linking Padua to Bologna. That very branch could be the historical Eridanus remembered in myth. Meanwhile, Adria, set where Aeschylus placed Phaethon's lament, grew from pile dwellings on marshland between the 10th and 6th centuries BC, while rival Spina turned Etruscan. Greek geographers give the city and the sea their names from an old Po distributary known as the Po of Adria. In Adria's environs, archaeologists have found tiny amber ducks and ram heads, charms that speak to waterways, flocks, and light in a culture nourished by the northern trade. All told, when Apollo is invoked as the ancestor of the fathers and the Hyperborean road is traced through the Adriatic and up the Po, the Veneti stand not at the margins, but at the hinge. Custodians of amber roots, interpreters of a northern god, and keepers of a river the poets renamed to make a myth flow. Aegean traders came to Adria for one thing above all: Baltic amber, which they seem to have exchanged for fine pottery and luxury wares. In the Greek world, the resin turned up most often in sanctuaries, such as the great Artemision at Ephesus, fitting the belief that amber belonged to Artemis. Its static charge, which draws lint and husks, made it ideal for protective charms, and its supposed healing force only heightened demand. The low Po and pole sign crafted the classic Tiryns-type beads, with work documented at Campistrin near Grignano, and, on a far larger scale, at Fraticina, the preeminent amber workshop outside the Baltic. By the 12th to 10th centuries BCE, this riverine hub already linked the northern resin road with the Aegean world, and the delta's Proto-Veneti likely secured their own supplies without relying on Mycenaean middlemen. One major line of traffic ran down the upper Adriatic into Greek and Italic markets. while still older streams of amber had crossed the Rhesia Pass and the Adige Valley during the Polada culture. The lagoon lanes then tied Adria to Este upstream on the Adige, and in time, Este forged close ties eastward with the Venetic community at Santa Lucia di Tolmino in today's western Slovenia, another large center rich in amber finds. Ancient notices suggest the Venetians themselves gathered and forward-shipped amber to the Greeks rather than the other way round. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, still doubted where the fabled Eridanus lay, which shows how hazy Greek knowledge of the land route remained. Only with Pythias of Massalia at the end of the 4th century BCE does the trail to the true source come into focus, when his northern voyage identified the amber shores of Abylos, the island we can match with Pliny's Bononia and the Samland Peninsula on the Vistula Lagoon. Even then, this was a seaway discovery, while the inland chain stayed obscure to Greek authors. A later wit, Lucian of Samosata, makes the same point in a dry anecdote from the Po. When he asked boatmen about poplars weeping amber, they laughed and said they would not waste their lives at the oar if such riches really dripped from the banks. The reputation of Venetian traders for sly protectionism fits this picture, from guarding horse breeding stock to keeping the resin roads secret.